So you spent 2 days in Berlin. Rob, what did you see? Who did you see? And what do we know?
Well, I mean, it's quite an interesting idea, really. Essentially, it's, as I said before, it's a marketplace. It's getting clubs from all over the world in the same room as agencies from all over the world. And all they're doing is talking about transfers. I mean, the actual setup of the room is quite interesting. You mentioned there that it's like speed dating. That's essentially exactly what it is. You sign up for an app. You can approach different clubs and different agencies for meetings. Those meetings last about, 15 minutes. You sit in a big room. There's a huge clock above your head counting down from 15 minutes to zero. That when it gets to 1 minute to go, there's a big bell that rings 3 times. That means that you get up and you shake hands and, you go your separate ways and on to the next meeting, on to the next transfer. So it's quite an interesting idea. And essentially it's just about sharing information. I mentioned there that it's the time of year where clubs are really starting to get their recruitment operations into gear ahead of the summer window. And clubs are really just trying to get in front of other clubs, in front of other agents to understand which players may be available, which areas of squads different clubs are looking to strengthen. Agencies are looking, where can they place their players? Can they place them permanently somewhere? Maybe they have to move on loan. So deals aren't necessarily being done across these tables. They're not shaking hands and players are moving then and there. But essentially, it's gathering information, getting that data together so they can start doing deals in the summer window once it opens.
I mean, your piece is online on ESPN.com, and it's a fascinating piece. And I think it's something that people should read to kind of educate themselves on the transfer market. I mean, I'm reading it thinking, well, I know a lot of fans are going to look at this and say, well, if you work at a club like Liverpool, Man United, Man City, Arsenal, whoever, you don't need to go to a place like this because you know whoever you need to speak to. But the reality is that there are so many clubs in the world now that you can't possibly know everybody at every club. And I think one example you made was the Viktor Gyökeres transfer 2 years ago from Coventry to Sporting Lisbon. Now, big deal. And obviously Gyökeres could become a big deal again this summer. But the reality is that deal basically began at one of these transfer room meetings because Sporting Lisbon and Coventry City had never had any connection before.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is. And you take a deal, say, De Ligt from Bayern to Man United in the summer. Bayern and Man United have done deals in the past. Their top representatives know each other anyway. They've seen each other. They've played each other in the Champions League. You have these UEFA dinners. You have those contacts. If Man United need to sign a player from Bayern, they've got the right number. And essentially, TransferRoom started because the people behind it realised that a lot of clubs, a lot of sporting directors of football didn't have the right numbers at clubs. And the Gyökeres one is a good example because Sporting Lisbon hadn't dealt with Coventry in the past, but they had a need for a centre forward of Gyökeres' profile. They knew that Coventry were open to listening to offers for Gyökeres because of the meetings that happened at TransferRoom, and were able to kind of start a dialogue in those meetings that ended up with Gyökeres moving to Sporting Lisbon. And as you've said there's a chance that he's going to be one of the big money signings in this window. And that Sporting and Coventry relationship is only one example. And there's hundreds of these examples across the world. Clubs that just would never have dealings with each other, but it's important for them to understand which players are available. Can they fill a need that they have? You mentioned there about the big Premier League clubs. Yeah, and the big Premier League clubs are not necessarily doing the bulk of their massive business in these meetings, but one of the things that the Premier League clubs do use it for, the big top 6 Premier League clubs, is to try and place their younger players. Traditionally, 25 years ago, Man United would place their younger players at clubs around the Northwest, Stockport, Rochdale, Bury, Crewe, Alexandra, but there's a much bigger world out there. So you end up with deals, like Zidane Iqbal, for example, when he was at Man United, kind of broke into the first team, but ended up moving permanently to Holland. Now, again, that's a relationship that wouldn't necessarily have existed if it hadn't been for these transfer room forums.
I must admit, I'm reading it, and it kind of, the image that came to mind was like a football version of a car boot sale. Now, for people that kind of don't understand a car boot sale, if you're outside the UK, it's when you basically turn up on a Sunday morning, you open your car up, your boot, your trunk, you've got a lot of things that unloved or used to love items that you don't need anymore, stuff that's not very good, lavish purchases that you kind of regret, that you want to get rid of. And it's basically anyone can turn up and say, oh, I fancy that bit of junk in your car, or I fancy that, something that could be quite useful. And that basically what it sounds like. You've got 10, 15 minutes to decide if you want to buy somebody else's rubbish or somebody else's junk, which might be very good for you. But that's just my perception of it. But I think one thing that struck me was interesting, Rob. You said that 17 Premier League clubs are represented. Do we know? Are you able to tell us who the 3 Premier League clubs that weren't there, who they are?
Probably
why not?
Not able to, only because there were 17 Premier League clubs there officially. There were another 3 who sent representatives who weren't necessarily part of the actual forum, but had sent representatives, because ultimately this transfer room is growing so much that clubs now cannot afford not to be part of it. And when I spoke to Simon Ankerson in Berlin, he said that this had started. And the first forum that they had was in 2018, and they had 50 clubs, which obviously isn't a lot when you talk about the amount of clubs that there are throughout the world. But what's happened is it's grown so much that clubs have decided that you just cannot afford not to be there. Now, different clubs sent different people within their organisation. It wasn't just sporting directors. It wasn't just directors of football. Some sent chief scouts, some sent data analysts, some sent like other people lower down within their scouting department. But what they've found is that clubs can't pass up the opportunity to be in these meetings, in this room, because there's so much information that's being exchanged between clubs. It's developing relationships between clubs that wouldn't necessarily have them. That if you are missing out, and there were 3 Premier League clubs who weren't officially represented there, although they did have people there to kind of look and see how it was working. The 3 Premier League clubs who weren't officially represented were looking at it and thinking, well, we can't not be a part of this. And there are big clubs who aren't on the forum. I think Real Madrid are one of them, because they tend to do their business in a different way. They trust their own scouting network. They trust their own database to have every single thing that they need to make these really informed choices. Well, really, out of all the big clubs in the world, Real Madrid are in the minority of that, because everyone else, whether it be Man City, Man United, Bayer Leverkusen, Bayern Munich, Barcelona, are all participating in these meetings in some way, whether it's to get a massive deal over the line, or whether it's just to send one of their younger kids to a place where they wouldn't necessarily send them. These clubs have decided that they have to be part of this, because ultimately it's the way that the transfer market is going.
Yeah, I think from reading the piece, it strikes me as that you're not going to get a big box office transfer out of this. It's not where Man United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Real Madrid go to do a big deal. It's where those clubs, for instance, like you say, might be looking to offload some of their unwanted players, the players that are year out in the contract they can't find a buyer for, or the young kids. That's the value for the bigger clubs. For the smaller clubs, or the clubs that have got data. It's more about them picking up bargains or trying to instigate moves or finding out what the big clubs are letting go. So they've got an idea in the summer what they can go for. So it's not really a case of, I'm not going to ask you what are the big deals you've heard about, because it's not really that idea, is it? It's more a case of beneath the top 5%. That's where the deals that we look at that catch our eyes. Beneath that, it's the deals that you don't often notice that are going to get done at TransferRoom. Yeah,
I mean, there were lots of conversations that were happening. Not necessarily the massive deals, but Man City are still in the same room as Bayer Leverkusen, and obviously they've been heavily linked with Florian Wirtz. I mean, while they're not kind of thrashing out the intricacies of that deal, there are conversations that are happening around a multitude of players. One of the players who was being talked about an awful lot was Liam Delap at Ipswich. Again, other clubs, representatives were trying to find out what was going to happen with Liam Delap. Does he want to stay in the Premier League, for example? Is he open to moving abroad? Is it a foregone conclusion that if Ipswich get relegated from the Premier League that he'll have to leave? What are Ipswich thinking about that? Do they think that there's half a chance that he might stay? These are all just very, very... I mean, these are things that I know that people may be listening thinking, well, that's a news story, that's a news story, and it probably is, but these are conversations that are happening all the time with any number of different players, because ultimately clubs can only act when they have that information. There's no point, I don't know, Bayern Munich, for example, putting a massive bid in for Liam Delap if they already know that Liam Delap has decided that he wants to stay in the Premier League or he wants to stay at Ipswich. Bayern just aren't going to do that. So what happens is that Bayern need to go and find out what his plans are, whether that's talking to his agent. And, again, there weren't just clubs at this meeting. There was 83 agencies, I think. So you can go and speak to the agent about what his plans are. You can go and speak to Ipswich about, what their plans are for him. Are they going to have to let him go? Are they going to do they want to keep him? And it all just adds to the kind of the bigger picture, the data that they have on these players, that when it comes to making offers and it comes to trying to sign players, that they can make a more informed choice. And the same goes for agencies. Agencies are there. There was one agency I spoke to, SEG, who look after Rasmus Højlund and Erik ten Hag, who went into these meetings with a list of around sort of between 80 and 100 players who they felt was half a chance that they could move in the summer. And again, it's about going to clubs and seeing if they can find a fit for that player. Is that club looking for a player of the same profile? Do they have the budget to pay for that transfer fee? Do they have the wage structure to pay the wages for that player? Ultimately, it's all just about exchanging information. And so when you get to the end of April, May, possibly the start of June, that you're in a really, really strong position to make these deals actually happen.
I know I looked at one of the quote from Brandon Lever at SEG, and he said that 99% of these chats don't really lead to a deal being done, but I suppose that 1% do, and the other 99% is a contact made, isn't it? And I suppose if you don't go, you don't know, and that's the value of being there, that you might not get a transfer out of it, but you've got a contact that you can refer back to in 6 months' time, a year's time, whatever, and somebody that works at a club or an agency that you can actually tap into in future.
Exactly. I mean, and he was really good actually explaining kind of what happens in these meetings, and a term he used more than once was planting seeds. Now, he's from an agency, so he's booking meetings with clubs across the world. He spoke to a load of Swiss clubs, he spoke to a load of German clubs, he also spoke to a load of English clubs. He's got a list of players that he thinks, or SEG think, could possibly move in the summer. Now, before these meetings, it's his job to kind of work on these lists and pitch players to the right clubs. There's no point him having a player who's going to cost £10 million and pitching him to a Serbian club who just don't pay £10 million transfer fees. That's completely pointless. So it's about matching what a club needs with the players that he or SEG have available. And you're right, he does say there that there are 99% of these meetings come to nothing, but there are these little seeds that start a transfer room that grow into something. And one of the examples he used was Mark Flecken at Brentford. Again, an SEG player at TransferRoom Forum a couple of years ago. He was, SEG representatives were talking to different clubs. You end up speaking to Brentford. Brentford say, actually, we're looking for a goalkeeper. SEG say, well, actually, we've got a couple here. What kind of thing are you looking for? Are you looking for someone who's great with his feet? Are you looking for more of a shot stopper? Looking for someone who's a really tall keeper who's going to come in for crosses? All these kind of things. Brentford say exactly what they're after, and they say, well, actually, we've got this guy, Flecken, who we think will be perfect. So Brentford then go away and check their own databases. They send scouts to watch him and watch videos. And from that tiny little seed that happens in a meeting, it goes on and on and on and moves forward to the point where Mark Flecken signs for Brentford and becomes one of the best goalkeepers in the Premier League. And that's the kind of thing that can happen at these transfer room forums that perhaps wouldn't have happened if SCG and Brentford weren't in the same room together.
I don't want to put you on the spot now, but I'm going to put you on the spot in terms of any deals that you can tee up for the summer. Any leagues that we should be looking at? I know the Swiss League gets mentioned. Any particular leagues or players that we should be looking for that might generate a transfer out of this meeting?
Well, I've mentioned that. I mean, I think that Liam Delap is obviously one to keep an eye out. I mean, we've done sections on this pod before where I think you in the past have spoken about how tough it is to find strikers. Real, well-established goal-scoring number nines. It's quite a dying art, to be honest. And Liam Delap has done so well in the Premier League in a team that ultimately has struggled and is probably going to get relegated, that there are going to be an awful lot of clubs looking at him, whether it's a return to Man City, whether it's Chelsea, whether it's Man United, whether there are clubs abroad who will look at him. I think that's certainly one to keep an eye on. Other than that, again, Florian Wirtz would be another one that I would say it looks relatively likely to leave in the summer. He's done probably everything he can do at Bayer Leverkusen. There's an awful lot of interest. Man City is one. Bayern Munich is another that's been interested. Real Madrid, another that's been linked simply because of Wirtz's profile within world football. There isn't an awful lot. One of the trends that they did a kind of a PowerPoint before the actual meeting started about kind of trends that they'd noticed within the transfer market, and there is kind of a reduction in some of the transfer spending that they're seeing with major clubs, because ultimately the financial restrictions are tightening and clubs have to kind of look after their budgets a lot more than perhaps they did sort of 5-10 years ago. That said, there are going to be big deals that happen in the summer simply because there aren't a lot of players that fit the profile or fit the bill for these massive clubs. So when you've got a player like Liam Delap, who has done really well for Ipswich in the Premier League, is now a kind of proven Premier League goal scorer. Because there aren't many players like that around, there is going to be an awful lot of interest, both from the Premier League and from abroad. And it wouldn't be a massive surprise to me if he has a really big transfer in the summer.
I did notice that the next one is in Buenos Aires, which that's kind of intriguing considering the talent that comes out of South America, particularly Argentina. Now, I'm not going to suggest we're looking for the next Lionel Messi, but we do know that Argentina is probably, I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, but that country seems to produce more players overseas than any other country in the world. So I imagine a lot of people are quite excited about going to Buenos Aires. Probably you as well, quite excited about it to see what happens there.
Well, yeah, and that is one of the things that came out of me going to Berlin, is that it wasn't necessarily about the players who were kind of on the market right now. That lots of the Premier League clubs, two of the big six Premier League clubs I've spoken to, said that they went there because there were areas of the world that they thought were not untapped is the wrong word, because obviously everyone knows that Brazil and Argentina produced really great players, but they didn't have the contacts and the coverage of those areas that perhaps they could. And there was one top six scout who I spoke to said that primarily the reason that he travelled to Berlin was because he wanted to meet with two Brazilian agents, because that was a line of communication that wasn't necessarily open. They wanted to use these agents to go into South America and scout essentially the next Messi. And that's obviously a stretch, but that's exactly what they were trying to do. And because there was we just mentioned there that with Delap, there are so few sort of top players that these clubs are going for, and the competition for these players is so great that there is a reason to go into South America and improve your scouting there, improve your contacts, because if you can get a 17-year-old player for €5 million, that's obviously far better than having to wait until he's 24 and paying €100 million. So there were a lot of Premier League Big Six clubs who were going to Berlin to try and meet these different agencies, particularly South American agencies, to try and get more of a foothold in the region. So when there is a fantastic young player coming from Argentina or Brazil, that they were first in the queue because they already have those contacts. They can ring someone up who they know they've met in Berlin anyway. They can ring them up and say, look, can you go and A, look at this player, B, speak to his family, C, find out who his agent is, D, find out all the financials around it, and then come back to us and report back. And when you have all that information, you're in a far better position to make these signings, I suppose, unearth these diamonds. Because if you can do that as a Premier League club, that's half the battle won. Then you're not having to spend millions and millions of pounds on transfer fees because you've already got the player in your training ground already.
Well, the La Liga title race has been dominated by players from South America. Some of the best players, we're talking Rafinha, Vinny Jr., Julian Alvarez. So after the break, we're going to talk about the La Liga title race and how close it's been this season.